Hello, everyone. So my name's Matthew Griffin. So I've got a little bit in common, basically, with Ollie from Bloomberg, basically, who was speaking earlier. He deals in futures. I deal in futures, too. But the type of futures, basically, that I deal in are probably a little bit different to his. So what I thought I'd do, basically, is change gears a little bit. So I'm going to put this into reverse. And we're going to have a conversation about data. Because this is what we're here for. This is what we are visualizing. Without data, we wouldn't be here. So, we all know that data is all around us. It's also in us. It's a tool. Used correctly, it can enable innovation and disruption. But if you want to do any of those things, you need to refine it first. Because raw data in a raw format, as we've seen here today, isn't necessarily meaningless, but it's very hard to really understand what the true value of that data could be and what it could do for you, your organizations, or for us as a society. We know this. Data's always being created. It's always being captured. And it's always being interpreted. But how it is created, the speed at which it's created, what data is being created, where it's being created, captured, and interpreted, all of these things are changing. And they are changing at an incredible rate. So today, we're using a $9 billion telescope to peer 13 billion years back into our past, at the edge of the universe. That same telescope can see a bee on the moon from 500,000 miles away. So we're collecting data from the very edges of the known and the unknown universe. On a very, very different type of scale, we're capturing data today basically from individual atoms. So these are atoms that we're actually observing now. 50 years ago, basically, we wouldn't have thought that we could actually see atoms at the atomic scale interacting with each other. Technology is moving. But when we're capturing all this data, what do we really want to do with it? From our perspectives, basically, we want to try to use it to try to understand what the truth of something is. We want to answer one question. Whether you're a chief executive, basically, or whether you're a student. So what? I have a lot of data. I have data in silos. I have access to 138 different databases, as we've sort of seen and heard from people here today. So what? So we are trying to combine data and visualize data and use data so that fundamentally we can do something with it, so that we can act. Now, in the past, 100 years ago, basically, we would have taken data, basically, and humans would have understood how we use that data to do something. Build a company, help a company grow, save costs, employ people, do whatever it happens to be, discover something new, create something new, destroy something. But today, increasingly, basically, it's not just so humans can act, it's also so machines can act. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And part of the reason that some of the people basically want to understand the value in data is because they want to change the world. And we are. So, to everyone in this room, depending on the industry that you work in, it might not be that obvious that everything in the world is changing. Every single industry is being disrupted. And it's because of what we're doing with the data that we're collecting. In the automotive industry, basically, we are producing autonomous cars. They're already here, and it's just a question of regulation, basically, and commercial costs to see when they sort of start arriving on the streets. In the world of aviation, basically, we are flying passenger planes beyond the edges of space. In the communications sector, we are putting 4,000 satellites basically into the sky so that we can connect every single person on the planet. We are 3D printing skyscrapers in China. Warfare in the military space. We are on the point of autonomous fully autonomous warfare. The US about 6 months ago launched their first fully autonomous warship and sent it off to join the Japanese 7th Fleet. They followed that up with a $4.4 billion 600-foot destroyer called the Zumwalt that can go and operate fully autonomously, pick out targets autonomously, and do whatever it wants to do with those targets autonomously. In the energy sector, so, Sugdeep basically was up here just having a conversation basically about, the national grid. By 2020, Los Angeles will be running on battery power without the need for power stations. In the financial services sector, we have artificial intelligence basically that is now replacing individuals, basically in, for example, Royal Bank of Scotland, because AIs can predict the stock market better than the wealth managers that RBS were previously paying. And it can do it for about 50 quid a year. In the agricultural sector, we are strapping sensors into everything. We are using drones, basically, and we are using synthetic biology to create new types of crops, new species of animals. Drones in this photo, basically, we're using drones basically to go and estimate basically harvest yields and crops and everything else. And again, all this is data, it's all being generated and we're generating more and more of it. We're producing lab-produced meat, so you no longer need a cow. This is what we can do with data. In the wealth management sector and insurance sectors, basically we are using an individual technology called blockchain to disrupt the $1 trillion general insurance industry. In the biotechnology sector, we have gene editing, basically, that we can do on the fly. So we have a technology called CRISPR that can write 6,000 of today's most incurable diseases and wipe it out. Now, Andrew, from the University of Nottingham, a little story. I know that the University of Nottingham basically have been looking, for example, at this type of technology, and they've created something called a biomaterial. So how many of you have teeth? Great. How many of you go to the dentist? Right. You can thank Andrew and the University of Nottingham for this particular thing, basically in about 10 years' time. How many of you got cavities? How many of you have got fillings? Oh, see. Well, in 10 years' time, you'll be able to eat as much sugary stuff as you like. So about 6 to 7 months ago, the University of Nottingham put together a whole heap of medical data, and they produced something called a biomaterial. So today, basically, if you have a cavity, you go to a dentist, you have a filling, it's an amalgam filling. In 10 to 20 years' time, it cracks, you go back in, and at the moment, our thinking is you have another amalgam filling, pay the dentist, and go away again. 20 years later, click repeat, thank you very much. So the University of Nottingham have just produced a biomaterial where, in the future, that amalgam filling will be a biomaterial. You put the biomaterial into the hole in your tooth grows back using stem cells. You don't need to go and have your amalgam filling replaced any longer because you have a new tooth. So I think we should probably give the University of Nottingham a piece of applause for that, because that is actually going to affect every single person on the planet. You can claim it. So I'm sure data analytics had something to do with that. Just say yeah. Yeah. Great invention. In the cybersecurity space, basically, we have AIs, basically, and robo-hackers that are now starting to hack each other. We are replacing human hackers with AIs. And the AIs, basically, are crazy fast, and they're crazy good. When we look at the transport sector, it's not just autonomous cars, basically, that we're seeing. We are seeing everything become autonomous, from spacecraft to airplanes to drones to buses and 500,000-ton tankers. So data is being used and combined to change the world. It's also fueling 9 new revolutions, and it's creating new markets that are worth $16 trillion. So we have a couple here. So autonomous vehicles, everybody's probably heard of self-driving cars, connected home, human 2. That's a fun one. We'll come on to that one in a little bit. The Internet of Everything, robotic revolutions. So if you think basically that your robo vacuum at home that you occasionally tread on or trip over basically is a cute little robot, basically, and its cousins basically are all cute little robots. No, they're not. And we'll show you that again. Technological singularity, smart cities, telehealth, wearable technology, all of these things, all of these trends, these mega trends, basically are producing huge volumes of new data. And from a data visualization perspective, some of these things basically will impact the type of data that you bring into your organization and the type of data that you visualize. And they'll also influence what you do with that data and how you use that to do whatever it is you want to do within a company. So we're living in an era of exponential technology. This essentially means that at the moment, a technology that is delivered, that is produced today, tomorrow isn't just a little bit better, it's a lot better. So there's more data, more sources, and it's impacting more things. It creates quite a visualization conundrum. Just wanted to get those words in there. Because when we start having a look at the amount of data, where it's coming from, it's crazy. So there are 178 emerging technologies at the moment. Every single dot basically on this chart, radar chart, is that the phrase? Every single dot on this radar chart is worth anywhere between $500 billion and around $6 trillion basically in new value. When you start combining these dots together, you get new products, new services, you get all sorts of things. And we've got 11 categories down the side. So we have new technologies and new emerging technologies coming at us from every single angle. Now, you might not necessarily use some of these basically within your own industries, but your supply chains will rely basically on advanced manufacturing. If you go into the NHS, they can now start 3D printing skulls and all sorts of things. So while you might look at some of these emerging technologies and think, well, that's cute, but hey, so what? Doesn't do anything for my industry. These are the technologies that are turning everything from the energy sector all the way through to the automotive and government sectors on their heads. And it's getting faster. These are them. This is the 178 pieces of technology. Obviously, you can see that. So we'll walk through some of them. So on the advanced manufacturing sector, again, this is a question basically of what you do when you combine data. What happens basically if you take a 3D printer and combine it with a space station? Any guesses? Yeah. Firstly, you need to add an expert, because experts are good. So the expert basically knows what he knows and everything else, but if you take a 3D printer, combine it with a space station, add in a little dash of expertise, you get a 3D printed heart at the edge of space that starts replacing the organ donation programs basically for the NHS, basically in the US healthcare system. And that's just the start. Our technologies are getting much, much smaller. So we are now not actually just at the nano scale. We're operating at the atomic scale and the electron and the photon scale. We are storing information in photons. As we start looking at biotech, we are literally transforming life. We are using different gene editing technologies, and again, this is just the start, to eradicate those 6,000 diseases that I talked about. Everything from things like depression and dementia, all the way through to arthritis, fibromyalgia, all these sorts of things. By 2036, we estimate that we can create the world's first artificial genome. Now, what that means is that by 2036, if you take an artificial genome, and this is Harvard, this is MIT, these aren't people who are playing around, these are people who know their stuff. This is University College of London. When you take an artificial genome and you put it into an egg, you have an artificial human. When you can start editing things at the DNA scale, if you want blue eyes, you want designer babies, basically we've already got some of those, you can do all sorts of things. We are recreating life. And as we're recreating life, basically we're also starting to recreate basically how we produce energy. So for example, you can get bacteria now, you can change some things in them basically and they'll produce crude oil. You can do things with bacteria now where if you want a beer that tastes a little bit orangey, you can use a synthetic bacteria for that. So we are literally transforming life, and as of about 2 years ago, we let God out of the box, and evolution is technically dead. As we start looking at digital connectivity, so again, when we start having a look at the amount of information basically in our collective universes, we are putting satellites into space that will connect the next 3.5 billion people. But whereas it took us about 50 years to connect the first 3.5 billion people, this is going to take 4 years. So by 2020, 2025 at the outset, we will have over 4,000 satellite systems in orbit from companies like Virgin, SpaceX, Qualcomm, all those kinds of guys, Facebook, Google, and we will be able to beam 15 gigasecond internet down to every single square kilometer, every single square centimeter of Earth. So what happens to your businesses when you start bringing on another 3.5 billion people online? In addition to bringing people online, basically we're bringing more and more devices online. We have nanobots, basically, that are now crawling around people's cells. And those nanobots can not only edit human DNA, basically, on the fly, in vitro, they can communicate back using Wi-Fi. So this is a particular nanobot that was used to impregnate that cell there to create a new cancer vaccine in China. We're connecting cities up and new human outposts. So by 2026, it looks conceivable that we will have people on Mars. We're bringing lots and lots of new game-changing things. But a lot of this is driven by what we call the sort of machine systems piece. We're designing computer devices that are now smaller than viruses. And the biggest one, there are two big ones, artificial intelligence. So at the moment, basically, we take information, we take data, we combine it together, we visualize it. We take those visualizations and we give them to somebody. Somebody somewhere basically thinks, okay, if we want to reduce costs, I have some graphs, I have some charts, I've got some visualizations here, and I think I know where I can chop people or where I can invest or whatever it happens to be. Increasingly, and this is starting in the operations space, so companies like BP, Shell, General Electric, those kinds of guys, are increasingly starting to flip those visualizations on their head, and they're just getting the machines to make the decisions for them. So the machines will go out crawling lots and lots of information, and the machines are the things that will decide just exactly how you optimize an organization. And these things are getting better. So this is a meeting basically with the director of MIT and President Obama. When they had to look at the artificial intelligence space, there was a White House report recently. And the White House report said, when we have a look at AI, and when we look at it from a narrow perspective, actually, yeah, it's quite nice. It could do some good things. The White House asked them to have a little bit of a longer view, basically, on the potential of AI. So something called super AI. And the people, basically, who were putting the reports together said, when we had a look into the capabilities of super AI, basically, which will be coming online about 2035, 2040, we didn't want to go there because the implications are just so crazy. It can either destroy the human race or it can make us immortal. Pick your grade. In addition to that, basically, we are now creating a new kind of distributed internet using a technology called blockchain. So all of the information that you have access to today is typically held in silos, whether it be within your own organization or whether it be within a third-party organization. Trying to get access, basically, to those silos of information can be a little bit tricky. The blockchain, basically, will put the entire ecosystem that you deal with, third parties that you deal with, third parties you don't deal with, onto what we call a chain. This technology is as significant as artificial intelligence, and many experts suggest that its influence basically is bigger than the internet itself. When you start connecting all these different companies together, so for example here we've got Tuna basically, and we've got a sandwich, and we've got John West. If all these companies are on the blockchain, and by the way, all these companies are on the blockchain, so we are now putting the global food supply chain onto the blockchain, you suddenly have access to all of the information on that chain. And if you have access to all that information, then the question is, how do you combine it to create new value? There's lots of new value. It's like the Internet of Things. Basically, there's lots of new value to be extracted from it, provided you know where to look and how to look. We have seeing machines, basically, that are coming online as well. Basically, so again, from a data perspective, we have machines now that are looking through videos and images, and they know what those videos and images are. They know what they contain. But in addition to that, we have CCTV systems that can now accurately gauge who you are. So seeing machines basically takes us into a whole different universe of information. And then once we have all of this information, basically we need to process it. So about a year ago, basically a lot of organizations, so NASA, Google, and a couple of others, basically decided to take huge information data sets at the exascale. And they fed it into what's known as a quantum computer. And they used a particular algorithm. That quantum computer processed that information 100 million times faster than today's logic-based computers. So again, the amount of data is growing, data volumes are growing, but also computing is actually keeping up and excelling. As we look at materials, again, smart materials, whether it be wearable materials, whether it's smart fabrics, whether it's the smart material basically on a YF-22 Joint Strike Fighter, materials are getting smarter. In the world of robotics, I said basically your vacuum cleaner, basically your vacuum cleaner's cousin basically wasn't cute and fuzzy. This is the world's most advanced humanoid robot. It's called Atlas. Some of the things it can do are so intimidating to people that they ended up having to make this robot 5'6" tall because it was deemed that it was going to be slightly less intimidating. But what we now have is when we have a look at the robot space, so take, for example, the Industrial Revolution, we take Industry 4, where we're connecting all these robots together. These robots basically are now learning from each other. They're communicating via the cloud, and they are using artificial intelligence to learn from each other at a global scale. You can call it a kind of robotic hive mind. So again, if you're taking information in, say, for example, you're a manufacturing organization and you're taking information in from your robots are learning from each other. Now, what are they learning? Is it a good thing for your organization, or is it a bad thing for your organization? What happens if someone sticks a funky virus basically in there? When we have a look at sensors, you might not know it basically, but in the streets of London, if any of you went to the Rio Olympic Games, you were under surveillance 24/7. So we have lots of new sensors, not just strapped into cities, but we have lots of sensors strapped into drones, et cetera, et cetera. We have persistent surveillance devices that will simply hover at about 3,000 to 5,000 feet, and they can keep track of everybody in a city, and they know who you are. So again, when we talk about things like anonymous data, we can use Wi-Fi now to read all of your emotions. So I'm glad you're really happy. So when we talk about the era of data and personal privacy, you're not just being tracked in here via your GPS, via your Wi-Fi signal. You're being tracked outside using facial recognition, using gait analysis, all sorts of things. Your privacy, you know that your privacy online basically is suspect. You know that there isn't really any such thing as online privacy nowadays. When we talk about privacy outside, we can read your fingerprints basically at 30 feet. I can read your iris basically at 30 feet. I can identify you precisely. I can read your brain waves at about 100 feet. And if I take your brain waves and I crunch them through an AI, I can tell if you're an alcoholic, let alone what your secrets are. And so again, these are the technologies that are here today. Those types of technologies are already being used in airports. So we are capturing much more information basically than anybody realizes. And it's a rabbit hole. However, once we have all this information, fundamentally, from an organizational perspective, what we really want to try to do is we want to try to use that information to create new products and services that engage our consumers, that delight our consumers, that get our consumers to buy more, to stay loyal, all this sort of thing. And there's a saying, I think IBM first came out with it, that data is the new oil. Data isn't really the new oil. Data should be the new solar, because oil isn't that friendly to the environment. When you start combining lots and lots of different types of data together, particularly at a macro level, you can start seeing what new industries are going to be formed. So there are lots of new industries that are coming down the pipeline. The one I thought I'd pick basically is extreme life extension. So for any of you basically who have children, Generation Z, born sort of since year 2000, it is more than likely that their lifespans will be anywhere between 200 and 300 years. So today we can replace 70% of the human body. We can 3D print parts of organs. We can 3D print kidneys. Prosthetics are great. You know, when we have a look at brain-computer interfaces, those are coming along really nicely as well. We can edit disease out of people, whether that be cancer or HIV. So recently we used a number of gene editing techniques to strip HIV basically out of an individual in London. The world's changing. However, at the moment, again, we're taking information, we're visualizing it, and we are the people basically who are determining what actions to take once we've had a look at that data. Increasingly, it's the machines. So when we have a look at the amount of brokering decision-making and the number of transactions that are being initiated and performed on our behalf by machines, there'll be a crossover point in about 2025 where machines will be making more decisions and doing more things for us basically than we will be. So for example, we've been handing decision-making over to the machines for years. You know, if you take a lift, how do you know that that lift isn't going to plummet to the ground? You trust basically that the software and that the brake systems work. Normally you'd use the stairs. When autonomous vehicles come out, at the moment any of that you drive, you press your own brake pedal. When there's an autonomous vehicle on the road, you won't be making that decision yourself. You'll be relying on a machine. We're increasingly getting the machines to do more and more of our thinking. Knowledge workers are slowly being replaced. We've got McLaren F1 basically who are replacing their big data PhDs basically with thinking machines. You know, when we talk about Bloomberg, basically we talk about, for example, all that data. You know, we have a look at all these graphs and everything else, but fundamentally, from my perspective, the question that I have is, what stock do I need to buy? And when do I need to sell it? That's it. To be honest, I don't really want to have a look through graphs, basically, and everything else. I want to ask that question. So we now have cognitive computing systems like IBM Watson, where we are trying to recreate, essentially, the Star Trek Enterprise computer, where you ask it, you say, what stock should I buy? How much should I invest? When should I sell it? What's the answer to life? But as more and more data basically comes into our ecosystems and into our lives, you've got to be really careful about what you believe, because there's a huge amount of false information already. So again, you know, when we're talking about predicting the stock markets, you know, just looking at Twitter, there are loads and loads of bots out on Twitter. So what suddenly happens, basically, if a bot starts flooding Twitter with, "We hate Apple," does that mean that Apple's share price does that? Does that mean that you buy at that point, or does it continue to slide? So the amount of data that is actually being produced, you've got to be very, very careful, basically, that the data in the future basically isn't actually false. Because if it is false, then you can end up with some really strange results. And I'm not really sure what you'd do with that, to be honest, but I think that's supposed to be a catfish. So, and that's it. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
No, really?
See, they're thinking.
Wow. Everyone's sort of shell-shocked.
The one about teeth, basically,
Yeah.
just...
It freaked them out.
Yeah, freaked them out.
Well, thank you very much for your time.